Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Light Reading Podcast. My name is Phil Harvey. I am an editor here at Light Reading.
I'm Kelsey Zeiser. I'm also an editor at Light Reading.
And this is Giuliano de Vitantonio. I'm the CEO of AtlasEdge.
Mr. D. Vitantonio, thank you very much for joining us. And also thank you for not having a cold, because Kelsey and I both sound like we're in NyQuil commercials, but you sound great. So thanks for being part of the podcast.
That's by miracle, because I flew this morning from Berlin to London, and it was snowing in Berlin when I left.
Oh wow!
So
okay, so
I wasn't prepared for that.
You've already had to deal with airports and everything this morning. So I mean, actually, let's get right into your company, AtlasEdge. So, could you give us so this is part of the a conglomerate that owns a bunch of different digital infrastructure concerns, and I think that should be pointed out, because it's like it's a part of a much bigger portfolio that's completely focused on building out, in building cellular, edge, edge networking, data centers, and so on. But what's the background on AtlasEdge specifically?
We're actually part of two portfolios, because we are a JV between two giants in the digital infrastructure world.
Okay.
On one side, we have one of the leading private equity firms investing in this space, DigitalBridge, and they indeed own several pillars and many companies in each pillar of digital infrastructure. But also Liberty Global, one of the leading telecommunication companies in the world. They also have a portfolio of companies in digital infrastructure. So AtlasEdge was formed in September 21 as a joint venture between these two investors, and with a very precise mission, which is to build the leading edge data center platform in Europe. And so it's a 50-50 joint venture between these two investors.
Okay. And you've had quite a bit background in data center, as an executive. You've worked, it seems like, in almost every post in various data center companies over your career. Were you ever in the telecom space, like purely in the sort of service provider area?
Interesting enough, no, I have not worked for a service provider, but I did my university degree in telecommunications. And then when I graduated, I had to choose between two offers, and one was from a telco provider, and one was from Hewlett Packard. And I picked Hewlett Packard. Was a good choice. I spent many years at Hewlett Packard. Then I joined Cisco. So with these two companies, I got a very good understanding of the software and the hardware that goes into data centers. And then in 2015, I came back to Europe, because I lived in the US for almost 15 years. I came back to Europe to join Interaction, which was one of the leading European providers of data center services. I was there for 6 years until Interaction got acquired by Digital Realty, one of the global leaders, actually the largest data center provider in terms of footprint in the world. And I was with Digital Realty for 2 years prior to joining AtlasEdge.
Excellent. So you've been around this quite a bit, and you've seen quite a number of changes in the networking and data center world since this happened. Kelsey, I'll yield to you. I have more questions, but I want to not hog the whole podcast, as I'm prone to do.
Giuliano, you had a recent blog that was pretty interesting about 5 observations at the edge, and wanted to pick your brain a little bit more about some of your points around how applications are changing in terms of, the intelligence of applications, but also the types that are emerging. How does that change edge computing strategies and approaches there?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you picked up on that post. We put a lot of thought into what we see as the key trends for edge, but the bottom line is that edge is nothing new, right? We've had compute capacity and storage capacity at the edge for many years. What's changing is the requirements of those applications, and in particular the amount of data that needs to be stored and processed at the edge. Just to give some examples, there are some applications that are really increasing the amount of what we call sensory input. the amount of data that gets collected, the resolution of, for instance, if you have an image, higher resolution, higher sample rate, that's an example. Some applications are becoming more intelligent, like autonomous vehicle is a classic example. Some applications are really cutting cutting new frontier in terms of requirements like augmented reality, IoT, 5G. So those are really more of the cutting edge. And some other applications are just applications that have been in existence for a long time, but they are being deployed closer and closer to the end users in points on the network that provide better latency to the end user. So there's a number of trends that are at play that all point to the edge as the next place where a lot of computing capacity is going to be processed. But these are new applications, but the edge has always been there. And it's just the amount of the volume of data and the amount of applications that require that it's really changing.
I've got um, a rather open-ended question, I guess, about the edge. Given your business, you might actually know this. Like, who decides to build at the edge? Because it's always sort of this thing of everyone needs capacity, lower latency, and connectivity at the edge. But depending on who you talk to, if you talk to application developers, there's sort of just this assumption that the infrastructure is going to be there, and you're in the infrastructure business, but you also have service providers and cloud providers that are also adding to their edge capabilities. So I guess that's where I'll leave it. Is who's responsible for building the edge, or do you build it on an as needed basis based on where your customers are guiding you?
Well, we as AtlasEdge, we definitely build as needed by our customers. So we are not going to speculate on where the edge is or what the edge is. There's a lot of this is a very overloaded term, so we don't want to add to that debate. We work closely with exactly the customers that you described, the what we call the platform providers, the service provider, digital media content providers. Those are the main drivers of consumption at the edge. And ultimately, their consumers, their users, whether they're businesses or individual consumers, they decide what needs to be processed at the edge. Then the question becomes, is it financially viable to build capacity at the edge to satisfy those needs, right? There's always a trade-off between application requirements and financial viability. Constructing data centers requires a lot of investment, and then the financial equation needs to work out. So working very closely with the customers, understanding their requirement, in turn understanding the customer's requirement, and then deciding whether there's a financial proposition to build, or in some cases, may not make sense to build capacity at the edge. Let me give you an example, right? People talk a lot about autonomous vehicles, and I know there's still those who believe that they will require data centers to almost follow the car along, or the car following the data centers. In reality, I believe there's going to be enough capacity inside the car to do most of the data storage and data processing within the car, inside the car. And so in that case, in that specific use case, I believe the role of data centers would be fairly marginal. They could play a role, but it would be fairly marginal. I don't see a viable case for building data centers just along a highway or a motorway. But there will be because again, there's a lot of capacity there that is
Yeah.
in the car, inside the car. But other applications that, for instance, we use on our devices that we carry in our hands, that's a totally different story, because the compute capacity there is going to be pretty limited. So having a data center nearby where you can do, for instance, the image rendering, that makes a ton of sense. So it's going to be really almost application by application, the decision is going to be made.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting, slightly more complex sort of scenario than what we have now, but it does kind of answer my question of like, yeah, where is that capacity initially going to be located? Because I I think I definitely agree with you that the build and wait for it is not the best
Yeah.
strategy, but there is a little bit of that going on, except that in the service provider world, except that they already have an idea of where, you know, where the biggest strains on their network are. So they're maybe not as speculative as it seems sometimes. They already triangulate where usage is occurring, and they can kind of extrapolate out, what new applications are going to be happening.
Absolutely. The service providers are going to be some of the drivers. For instance, anything to do with 5G, right, is going to happen at the edge. So they understand 5G, they understand the requirements of the applications that will leverage 5G. So they are very well positioned to determine what type of capacity is required in relation to 5G. So that's why we're working with them very closely. That's another category of customers that are going to play a big role in defining the requirements.
Yeah, and I thought you made some other interesting points in the blog too about data sovereignty and sustainability as some other requirements to consider when pushing to the edge. Can you talk a little bit more about what to consider? Whether you should focus on edge computing. I mean, you mentioned like with autonomous vehicles, not every application is going to need it. So if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, especially here in Europe, certainly data sovereignty, but also sustainability are a big driver. I think data sovereignty in particular is very specific to Europe more than North America, because there's going to be more and more stringent requirement to store and process the data within the country's border. Right? In the US, that doesn't happen as much within the state border, but certainly in Europe within the country's border. And so the geographic fragmentation of Europe in that case really plays a role in having a more distributed digital infrastructure footprint, because you really need to be within the country borders. So data sovereignty very specific to Europe and a big driver, but sustainability is a more global trend, of course, right? And uh, today, what's happening with the big cloud deployments, they're just getting so big that it's almost impossible to manage them. And so we are seeing that when you have a concentration of hundreds and hundreds of megawatts in the same location, we're seeing in multiple cities around the world, so all sorts of limitations being put on how much more capacity you can deploy. So to me, that in itself would be a massive drive to be more and more distributed, basically less capacity in more locations. We are seeing this from customers, we are seeing this from regulators, but it also starts making sense when you actually look at some of the sustainability aspects that would make the whole industry more friendly to the environment. For instance, the ability to reuse the heat that the data center produce, that is a big factor that could help injecting energy back into the environment. And the consumption of the heat that get reused needs to be within a certain radius of where it is produced. And so if you have all of that capacity concentrated, say, around Frankfurt in Germany, the ability to reuse that heat within that geographical area is very limited. But if you start now having 10 locations within Germany or 20 locations within Germany where you do that, there's a much broader population that can reuse the heat that gets produced. So that, from a sustainability standpoint, in itself is a big plus. So there's a number of trends that point to the fact that we're going to see much more distributed data center capacity in the next decade than we've seen in the past decade.
How specifically are they reusing the heat? I'm picturing a world where we have hot yoga and humidors opening up next to data centers, but that's
Hard pass on
probably
the
ridiculous.
hot
Yeah,
yoga.
It's incredible because that's exactly the same idea that a member of my team had. We are designing a data center in a
give that
specific
person a
location and
raise.
say, what would be the ideal business to put next to the data center to
Yeah,
maximize the heat reuse? And they came out with the idea of a spa, right? So the
yeah.
spa would be the perfect
Just
business.
pipe it in and be like, here you go, 120 degrees, no problem. I don't know.
It's a
I
smart
mean,
spa, right?
yeah,
It's a
smart
smart
spa,
spa.
right?
Consuming a lot of data as well.
Right.
So it's a
I've seen worse ideas in terms of the fitness trends, but I am curious though that so the reuse of heat, how does that happen in more of in industrial applications, or is that able to, is that used in adjacent businesses, like exactly how do they reuse the heat?
Industrial, but also residential. We can
Oh,
heat.
okay.
We can heat apartments. We can
Oh,
heat
that's great.
homes.
Okay.
So it's just been putting the heat back into a good use rather than having it wasted in
Right.
the environment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another, so sustainability is clearly, and Atlas Edge is a global company. They've got, what is it? You're in 100 countries or something like that.
No, we are at the moment we only operate in Europe, so we are roughly a dozen countries at the moment, but we plan to go to more countries across Europe. But
I was
we
gonna
are in
say
more than
100.
100
It must have been
locations.
100
100
locations or 100.
locations
Yeah.
across
Okay,
Europe.
that's what it
Yes,
was. I
yes.
got the data confused. And I'm training myself not to look at
I
Google while
wouldn't be
we're
able
talking.
to name 100 countries around the world. And maybe I
It's
can try.
it's because Phil did some hot yoga before
Oh,
this podcast.
I
So
could definitely name 100 countries because I'm always, I've always got the wanderlust of, where should I go next? Uh, but what I was going to ask is, so sustainability and data sovereignty shapes the structure of, how much and where you can build out capacity. The next thing I think would be uses of artificial intelligence and just the kind of larger computing and latency requirements on that. Has that started to affect how data centers are built or how they're how the data is consumed from your point of view?
Absolutely no. First of all, I mentioned data sovereignty and sustainability, but those are only two of the factors. At the end of the day, the main driver, in terms of deciding where you place data centers, there's an incredibly high correlation with GDP and eyeballs, right? Where the
Okay,
money, where the people are, that's where data centers tend to go.
sure.
So that's a main driver. But yes, new applications like AI shape the requirement, and AI in particular is driving a much higher density. And what we mean with density is the amount of power per unit of the surface that you need to drive an application. In the case of AI, the data processing requirements are so intense that you almost double or triple the traditional density you would have for a more traditional application. So certainly a big driver, not just in terms of demand, but also in terms of shaping the requirements for a data center capacity, which in turn requires technical innovation. Now you can start thinking that you need to do immersive cooling in order to cool a data center that had that level of density and capacity. So yes, AI is gonna change a lot of aspects of our life, but also data center architecture for sure.
Makes sense. Kelsey, you have a follow up or next question? I have one more.
yeah, I was just curious. I know I keep looking at your blog, but there's so much to unpack there. And there was, a point about aggregation hubs and proximity hubs, and was wondering if you could talk more about, what those are and what that means for accessing edge computing.
Yes. So if you think of what a data center does, right? It performs certain functions, but ultimately boils down to a couple of main things. One, data centers that become an aggregation point for data and traffic that comes from multiple companies or multiple users, right? Historically, those were called carrier-neutral data centers because that's where all the telco providers would collocate to exchange traffic. So if you call, I don't know, if you call an Uber, for instance, all the service providers wants to be in the same location where Uber can interconnect with them. So no matter which provider you use, which mobile provider you use, you will get your Uber call routed, right? So that's one type of data center that really becomes an aggregation hub for traffic and data from multiple players. And then there are data centers that are more focused on actual data processing, and in some cases from multiple companies, but in some cases just even from one company. And most of the hyperscale data centers that we hear about, the 100 plus megawatts, they're actually dedicated to a single company that uses that data to do most of the data processing and data storage. Of course, those data centers need to be connected back to the aggregation hubs, but they tend to be more dedicated. So at the edge, we will see both types. We will see the aggregation hubs where all the data gets exchanged, and you will see more and more locations where data exchange takes place. Today, if you take a country like the UK, where I live. There's a couple of aggregation hubs in London, and there's one emerging in Manchester. We believe that within the next decade, we're going to have at least 10 to 12 aggregation hubs across the UK, in cities like Leeds, Birmingham, Bristol, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Cardiff. We see more locations where the data aggregation takes place. And we're seeing exactly the same thing in the US. Historically, in the US, there were 4 or 5 locations, North Virginia, New York, Chicago, Dallas, and Silicon Valley, where most of the data aggregation took place. Now you start seeing in places like Raleigh, Milwaukee, Denver, Portland, many more locations where you see that aggregation. So that's one type of data center will become more and more regionalized. But then the pure dedicated data center, or the ability to do data processing, will be much closer to the end users. And that's where the notion of proximity hub becomes important, because you really want to have that data center really close to the end user. That's where latency, bandwidth consumption becomes a factor, and you want to be very, very close to the end user. So the proximity hub will be another big driver. Again, focus more on the data storage and processing. And in some cases, you will have both functions perform in the same data center. You will have data center can be both an aggregation hub and a proximity hub, but the requirements will be different and from different applications.
Interesting. We're getting a little tight on time, but I have one more question, just in terms of trends that you're looking, as you're looking out over the next year or so. What industries seem to be consuming more data center capacity and kind of and maybe even using the cloud more? Because I know that I would assume that earlier on your business was dominated by tech specific and connectivity oriented businesses and industries, but has there been any change in the industry mix that you're seeing in terms of where the growth is coming from?
Well, in terms of who buys data center capacity for a company like AtlasEdge, the transition you just described is the main one. It used to be telco service providers that were the main consumers of data center capacity. Today is the hyperscalers, what we call the platforms, the big the big 5 and the big 10 platform providers. However, what's interesting is to see who consumes the platform that these players make available. Right? What are the verticals within the industry that consume a lot of that? And I've seen historically a lot of content companies, content providers, digital media companies, providing the lion's share, especially when video became critical. Video consumes more data than any other application. So video has been a big driver. And I think when you move from video to augmented reality, that will be the next big driver. So within the platform world, I would say digital media, anything content related is going to be a big driver. Of course, financial services, you're going to see historically big users of data centers, and with all the AI, all the data processing happening in that industry, also big consumption, and probably healthcare more and more as it gets more distributed and closer to the end user. So those are the big 3 that we tend to monitor.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's not terribly surprising, but it is interesting that they are that you have that visibility down into the customer's customer. I guess that's one thing that that's where I guess the workloads kind of change in terms of their capacity needs and maybe latency as well.
That's key. To understand the customer requirements is absolutely critical, because you mentioned workload. So what we refer to as workload placement depends on what applications the customer use. And if we don't have visibility into that, you will never be able to predict where that placement takes place.
Makes sense. Okay, well, I think we should wrap it up here for the sake of time. Kelsey, thanks so much as ever for doing what you do, and I want to thank our guest Giuliano di Vitantonio. Did I say it correctly that time?
Perfect, spot on.
Okay.
You're getting better and better each time.
He's the CEO of AtlasEdge, and he pronounces his name way better than I do. But thank you so much for your time and your patience on our podcast today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.